that Johnson well knew the most proper course to be pursued in the instruction of youth is authentically ascertained by the following papers in his own handwriting, given about this period to a relation, the Reverend Samuel Ford, and now in the possession of Mr. John Nichols. Scheme for the classes of a grammar school. When the introduction or formation of nouns and verbs is perfectly mastered, let them learn Cordarius by Mr. Clark. Beginning at the time the same, translate out of the introduction, that by this means they may learn the syntax. Then let them proceed to Erasmus, with an English translation by the same author. Class 2 learns Europeus and Cornelius Nepos, or Justin, with the translation. N.B. Nota bene. The first class gets for their part every morning the rules which they have learned before, and in the afternoon learns the Latin rules of the noun and verbs. They are examined in the rules which they have learned every Thursday and Saturday. The second class doth the same whilst they are in Eutropius. Afterwards their part is in the irregular nouns and verbs, and in the rules for making and scanning verses. They are examined as the first. Class 3. Ovid's Metamorphoses in the morning, and Caesar's Commentaries in the afternoon. Oh, that sounds like a pleasant day, doesn't it? Practice in the Latin rules so they are perfect in them. Afterwards, in Mr. Leeds' Greek grammar, examined as before. Afterwards, they proceed to Virgil, beginning in the same time to write themes and verses, and to learn Greek. From thence passing on to Horace, etc., as shall seem most proper. I know not well what books to direct you to, because you have not informed me that study you will apply yourself to. I believe it will be most for your advantage to apply yourself wholly to the languages till you get to the university. The Greek authors I think is best for you to read are these: Cebes, Aelian, Lucian by Leeds, Xenophon, Attic, Homer, Ionic, Theocrates, Doric, Euripides, Attic and Doric. Thus you will be tolerably skilled in all these dialects, beginning with the Attic, to which the rest must be referred. In the study of Latin, it is proper not to read the latter authors till you are well versed in those of the purest ages, as Terence, Tully, Caesar, Sallust, Nepos, Valerius, Paterculus, Virgil, Horace, Phaedrus. The greatest and most necessary task still remains to attain a habit of expression without which knowledge is of little use. This is necessary in Latin, and more necessary in English, and can only be acquired by a daily imitation of the best and correctest authors. Sam Johnson. While Johnson kept his academy, there can be no doubt that he was insensibly furnishing his mind with various knowledge. But I have not discovered that he wrote anything except a great part of his tragedy of Irene. Mr. Peter Garrick, the elder brother of David, told me that he remembered Johnson borrowing the Turkish history of him in order to form his play from it. When he had finished some part of it, he read what he had done to Mr. Walmsley, who objected to his having already brought his heroine into great distress, and asked him, "How can you possibly contrive to plunge her into deeper calamity?" Johnson, in sly allusion to the supposed oppressive proceedings of the court in which Mr. Walmsley was register, replied, "Sir, I can put her into the spiritual court." How droll. Mr. Walmsley, however, was well pleased with this proof of Johnson's abilities as a dramatic writer, and advised him to finish the tragedy and produce it on the stage. Johnson now thought of trying his fortune in London, the great field of genius and exertion, where talents of every kind have the fullest scope and the highest encouragement. It is a memorable circumstance that his pupil David Garrick went thither at the same time, with intention to complete his education and follow the profession of the law, from which he was soon diverted by his decided preference for the stage. Both of them used to talk pleasantly of their first journey to London. Garrick, evidently meaning to embellish a little, said one day in my hearing, "We rode and tied," and the Bishop of Killaloe informed me that at another time, when Johnson and Garrick were dining together in a pretty large company, Johnson, humorously ascertaining the chronology of something, expressed himself thus: "That was the year when I came to London with 2 pence halfpenny in my pocket." Garrick, overhearing him, explained, "Eh? What do you say, with 2 pence halfpenny in your pocket?" Johnson, "Why, yes, when I came with 2 pence halfpenny in my pocket, and thou, Davy, with 3 halfpence in thine." This joint expedition of these two eminent men to the metropolis was many years afterwards noticed in an allegorical poem on Shakespeare's Mulberry Tree by Mr. Lovibond, the ingenious author of The Tears of Old Mayday. They were recommended to Mr. Coulson, an eminent mathematician and master of an academy, by the following letters from Mr. Walmsley. Mr. Coulson was first master of the Free School of Rochester. In 1739 he was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge. Okay. And here's a letter. To the Reverend Mr. Coulson. Lichfield, March 2nd, 1737. Dear Sir, I had the favor of yours and am extremely obliged to you, but I cannot say I had a greater affection for you upon it than I had before, being long since so much endeared to you, as well as my early friendship, as by your many excellent and valuable qualifications. And had I a son of my own, it would be my ambition, instead of sending him to the university, to dispose of him as this young gentleman is. He and another neighbor of mine, one Mr. Samuel Johnson, set out this morning for London together. Davy Garrick is to be with you early the next week, and Mr. Johnson to try his fate with a tragedy, and to see to get himself employed in some translation, either from the Latin or the French. Johnson is a very good scholar and poet, and I have great hopes will turn out to a fine tragedy writer. If it should any way lie in your way, doubt not but you would be ready to recommend and assist your countrymen. G. Walmsley. How he employed himself upon his first coming to London is not particularly known. One curious anecdote was communicated by himself to Mr. John Nichols. Mr. Wilcox, the bookseller, on being informed by him that his intentions was to get his livelihood as an author, eyed his robust frame attentively, and with a significant look said, "You had better buy a porter's knot." He, however, added, Wilcox was one of his best friends. I, meaning Boswell, never heard that he found any protection or encouragement by the means of Mr. Coulson, and the letter didn't do him much good, to whose academy David Garrick went. Mrs. Lucy Porter told me that Mr. Walmsley gave him a letter of introduction to Lintott, his bookseller, and that Johnson wrote some things for him. But I imagine this to be a mistake, for I have discovered no trace of it, and I am pretty sure he told me that Mr. Cave was the first publisher by whom his pen was engaged in London. He had a little money when he came to town, and he knew how he could live in the cheapest manner. His first lodgings were at the house of Mr. Norris, a staymaker, in Exeter Street, adjoining Catherine Street in the Strand. I dined, said he, very well for 8 pence, with very good company, at the Pineapple in New Street, just by. Several of them had travelled. They expected to meet every day, but did not know one another's names. It used to cost the rest a shilling, for they drank wine. But I had a cut of meat for 6 pence, and bread for a penny, and gave the waiter a penny. So that I was quite well served. nay, better than the rest, for they gave the waiter nothing. He, at this time, I believe, abstained entirely from fermented liquors, a practice to which he rigidly conformed for many years together at different periods of his life. His Ophilus in the art of living in London, I have heard him relate, was an Irish painter, possibly Michael Ford, 1759, as suggested by Professor J.B. Kirby, whom he knew at Birmingham, and who had practiced his own precepts of economy for several years in the British capital. He assured Johnson, who I suppose was then meditating to try his fortune in London, but was apprehensive of the expense, that £30 a year was enough to enable a man to live there without being contemptible. Not so much these days. He allowed £10 for clothes and linen. He said a man might live on a garret at 18 pence a week. Few people would inquire where he lodged, and if they did, it was easy to say, "Sir, I am to be found at such a place." By sending 3 pence in a coffee-house, he might be this for some hours every day in very good company. He might dine for 6 pence, breakfast on bread and milk for a penny, and do without supper. On Clean Shirt Day, he went abroad and paid visits. Clean Shirt Day. I haven't had my Clean Shirt Day yet. I have heard him more than once talk of this frugal friend, whom he recollected with esteem and kindness, and did not like to have any one smile at the recital. "This man," said he gravely, "was a very sensible man, who perfectly understood common affairs, a man of a great deal of knowledge of the world, fresh from life, not strained through books. He borrowed a horse and £10 at Birmingham. Finding himself master of so much money, he set out for Westchester in order to get to Ireland. He returned the horse, and probably the £10 too, after he got home." Considering Johnson's narrow circumstances in the early part of his life, and particularly at the interesting era of his launching into the ocean of London, it is not to be wondered at that at an actual instance, proved by experience, of the possibility of enjoying the intellectual luxury of social life upon a very small income, should deeply engage his attention, and be ever recollected by him as a circumstance of much importance. He amused himself, I remember, by computing how much more expense was absolutely necessary to live upon the same scale with that which his friend described, when the value of money was diminished by the progress of commerce. It may be estimated that double the money might now with difficulty be sufficient. Amidst this cold obscurity, there was one brilliant circumstance to cheer him. He was very well acquainted with Mr. Henry Hervey. The Honourable Henry Hervey, third son of the first Earl of Bristol, quitted the army and took orders. He married a sister of Sir Thomas Aston, by whom he got the Aston estate and assumed the name and arms of that family. Vide Collins' peerage. Mr. Henry Hervey, one of the branches of the noble family of that name, who had been quartered at Lichfield as an officer in the army, and had at this time a house in London where Johnson was frequently entertained, and had an opportunity of meeting genteel company. Not very long before his death, he mentioned this, among other particulars of his life, which he was kindly communicating to me, and he described this early friend, Harry Hervey, thus: "He was a vicious man, but very kind to me. If you call a dog Hervey, I shall love him." He told me he had now written only 3 acts of his Irene, and that he retired for some time to lodgings in Greenwich, where he proceeded in it somewhat further, and he used to compose walking in the park, but did not stay long enough at this place to finish it. At this period, we find the following letter from him to Mr. Edward Cave, which has a link in the chain of his literary history it is proper to insert. To Mr. Cave, Greenwich, next door to the Golden Heart, Church Street, July 12th, 1737. Sir, having observed in your papers very common offers of encouragement to men of letters, I have chosen, being a stranger in London, to communicate to you the following design, which, I hope, if you join in it, will be of advantage to both of us. The history of the Council of Trent having been lately translated into French and published with large notes by Dr. Le Courrier, the reputation of that book is so much revived by England that it is presumed a new translation of it from the Italian, together with Le Courrier's notes from the French, could not fail of a favorable reception. It is to be answered, if it be answered, that the history is already in English, it must be remembered that there was the same objection against Le Courrier's undertaking, with this disadvantage that the French had a version by one of their best translators, whereas you cannot read 3 pages of the English history without discovering that the style is capable of great improvements. But whether those improvements are to be expected from the attempt, you must judge from the specimen, which, if you approve the proposal, I shall submit to your examination. Suppose the merits of this version are equal, we may hope that the addition of the notes will turn the balance in our favor, considering the reputation of the annotator. Be pleased to favor me with a speedy answer if you are not willing to engage in this scheme, and appoint me a day to wait upon you if you are. I am, sir, your humble servant, Sam Johnson. It should seem from this letter, though subscribed with his own name, that he had not yet been introduced to Mr. Cave. We shall presently see what was done in consequence of the proposal which it contains. In the course of summer he returned to Lichfield, where he had left Mrs. Johnson, and there he at last finished his tragedy, which was not executed with his rapidity of composition upon other occasions, but was slowly and painfully elaborated. A few days before his death, while burning a great mass of papers, he picked out from among them the original unformed sketch of this tragedy, in his own handwriting, and gave it to Mr. Langton, by whose favourite copy of it is now in my possession. It contains fragments of the intended plot and speeches for the different persons of the drama, partly in the raw materials of prose, partly worked up in verse, as also a variety of hints for illustration, borrowed from the Greek, Roman, and modern writers. The handwriting is very difficult to read, even by those who were best acquainted with Johnson's mode of penmanship, which at all times was very particular. The king, having graciously accepted of this manuscript as a literary curiosity, Mr. Langston made a fair and distinct copy of it, which he ordered to be bound up with the original and the printed tragedy, and the volume is deposited in the king's library. His Majesty was pleased to permit Mr. Langton to take a copy of it for himself. The whole of it is rich in thought and imagery, and happy expressions, and of the dejecta membra, dismembered limbs, scattered throughout, and as yet unarranged, a good dramatic poet might avail himself with considerable advantage. I shall give my readers some specimens of different kinds, distinguishing them by the italic character. Nor think to say, here will I stop, here will I fix the limbs of transgression, nor farther tempt the avenging rage of heaven. When guilt like this once harbors in the breast, those holy beings, whose unseen direction guides through the maze of life the steps of man, fly the detested mansions of impiety, and quit the charge to horror and to ruin. Well, we're at the right time to stop for today. Till next time, bye from Boswell.